Earlier this month, the Nigerian government passed a revised 2020 budget of over 10.8 trillion naira as against the 10.5 trillion earlier sent by President Muhammadu Buhari. According to the Senate, the upward review of the budget is necessitated by the impact of COVID-19, which has affected oil prices as well as revenue projections. Closer look at the budget reveals that while the sum of 2.4 trillion naira was allocated for capital projects, about 4.9 trillion is set aside for recurrent. And while 422 billion was set aside for statutory transfers, 2.9 trillion was budgeted for debt service. Now, as we await the assent of the Senate revised 2020 budget, analysts have begun to weigh in on the impact of COVID-19 on the proposed performance of the budget. So joining me in the studio to discuss this is Mrs. Margaret Ogundana, an economist, retired deputy director of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and a principal consultant at Margo International Resources. Good morning to you, Ma. Welcome to the show. First, how do you, justify the upward review of the budget by the Senate from 10.5 trillion earlier to 10.8?
Thank you very much for having me on this, your very laudable program. Let me start by saying something. We have to understand what budgeting and planning is all about. Planning is budgeting, budgeting is planning. Budgeting identifies what are the issues, what are the objectives. So you now have to have a streamlined way in which you identify what objectives, which are in a planning concept, and also you now do a budget to identify how you want to go about achieving those objectives which have been identified in your planning proposal. So now you're talking about an increase in the budget for the year 2020, and it is inevitable that such an increase will come about. Why? Because of the pandemic. When the budget proposal starts, normally it starts the last quarter of every year. You start making a proposal for the following year. Then in a situation like that, like let's say for instance 2019, this COVID pandemic came about towards the last quarter of the year. So there was no idea that such a thing was going to come up. So definitely whatever had been budgeted had to be reviewed upward, because we are in the case of a pandemic, which is an emergency, which nobody had thought about. And so government, being government, has to identify with the people and ensure that lives are protected. And especially also that there's continuity in governance and the economy, just to save lives and ensure that whatever challenges are out there has to be taken care of. So hence the upward review in the budget, from my personal opinion, and I think it's in order.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So necessary to save lives. Okay, so if we talk about deficits now, current revenue for Nigeria, looking at about 8 trillion, yet we plan to spend about 10. What is the global best approach for deficit handling, and what is currently obtainable in Nigeria's deficit management regime, in your view?
Now, for every budget, there's always a provision to finance that budget. And that provision also dovetails into what do we have coming in. Like you rightly mentioned, there was a proposal for a revenue of 8 trillion. And now we're having a budget of 10.8. So there will be what is normally known as filling the gap in between the revenue proposed and the expenditure proposed. You see, budget is a statement of intent. It is something, it's a proposal. So there's nothing wrong in updating it as at when the need arises and based on realities of every situation. So looking at best practice, as you had asked, there's nothing wrong in government coming out to fund the budgetary gap by going to the market to source for funds. And that's why they will do borrowing. They borrow by issuing government debt instruments, both locally and internationally. And that is the standard practice the world over. You have to come out to the market. So the bonding proposal is usually through bonds, through everything government debt instruments like treasury bills and what have you, FGM bonds and like Sukuk. All those ones are avenue through which government gets money to finance its budget and whatever deficit comes out of it as a result of the gap between the revenue proposed and the expenditure.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So based on that, how then do you think COVID-19 is going to affect the performance of the government in plugging that gap and then getting out what it plans to do with the budget?
From the analysis propounded by the Federal Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister already told us that we're in a recession. And that recession has been brought about because of the impact of the COVID-19, which created a lockdown the world over. And that lockdown also meant there was no demand. For quite a while, if you've been reading the news, it showed us that even the oil, which constitutes almost 80% of total revenue derivable to the Nigerian economy, many of the ships on the high seas filled with oil, with no demand for them. So, be that as it may, irrespective of whatever happens, government has to borrow to fill the gap, because the revenue proposed for the 2020 budget, which started in 2019, may not be able to be realized as much as what is expected. So definitely, government will have to borrow. And if you look at what has been doing, what has been happening lately, they'll be borrowing, using treasury bills, they'll be borrowing, using the oil resources as collateral for foreign loans and what have you. And that one may continue. So the recession, there's nothing strange about it. It happens the world over. And like I said, this pandemic, like we all know, is a worldwide event. So Nigeria is not, shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised at what is going on. So it may be with us for quite a while, but I'm sure at the end of the day, government will synergize its activities and enable the general populace of citizens to still get whatever it is they need to get from a budget, and then move on from there.
Okay.
Going forward.
That's optimistic. I like that. So speaking of that synergy of those activities, I want to ask you about tracking. How then can budget spending and budget project deliverables be monitored and tracked in light of the fact that most people, are working from home and will be in the nearest future?
That's a good question. The component of a budget, like I said, is a statement of intent. The component is prepared. I'm looking at the federal government budget as it is. It's prepared by the ministries, the departments, and the agencies. So between the Budget Office, the Federal Ministry of Finance, Central Bank of Nigeria, and all those MDAs, they have a kind of think tank, a kind of committee that looks at the realities. What have we budgeted? A budget is a proposal. What have we proposed to spend in this fiscal year? Then what is it that will be coming up? What are the realities of the situation? Are we getting what we had proposed to spend? If not, what alternatives do we have? Now, what happens in a situation like that is that at the inception of a budget, the committee looks at the exigencies of every situation. A budget, like I said, is like a cycle. You start by indicating what the needs are, how do we achieve those needs, those objectives, and what is the financial outlay. Like we all know, government is broke in the sense that the oil is not coming in with so much revenue, and unfortunately, we don't have such strong infrastructures to help us to derive benefit from the solid minerals, which really is plentiful also in this our nation. So what happens is that the think tank, I want to call them the think tank, that is committee derived from the MDAs, the Central Bank of Nigeria, and the ministries, and the Federal Ministry of Finance that handles the budget, and the Budget Office, and the DMO. They also need to sit down, normally, which is what they do, and look at the proposal being made, look at how do we achieve. If, for instance, the revenue is not enough, they will look at alternatives. Let's say, for instance, you want to construct road, which is a major infrastructure. Maybe they can start by doing palliatives. They can go ahead, identify that road, if it has what I would call economic substance to promoting growth. They can identify the road and strategize by inviting contractors and what have you to start looking into it. So anytime the money is available, they look at the priority of what they need to do and try and manage whatever is available going by the circumstances that is on ground.
All right. Thank you for that. I also want to talk about global trade, right? At the moment, looks to have declined. Global trade seems to have declined owing to the pandemic. Also, lots of countries are having bilateral agreements rather than multilateral. Yeah. And Nigeria, of course, is not exempted from this. How do you think a Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala candidacy, or eventual, if you are just to get the position as the Director General of the World Trade Organization, will fare for Nigeria and African nations in the region in terms of balanced trade relationships with the West?
When you look at the African continent, I want to say that we are like an underdog. Underdog in the sense that because of our poor infrastructures, we have not been able to develop as much as we would have loved to. Africa usually is described as a less developed continent because on that basis, they do a comparative analysis with other developed economies. Now with our own Dr. Okonjo-Iweala becoming the DG or at the helm of affairs of the WTO, I think that is one feat that every African, not just Nigeria, should be proud of. Dr. Mrs. Okonjo-Iweala is a notable economist. She was recently appointed as chairman of the Economic Council in South Africa, in the South African region. And what that brings to the table for us is that there will be improved trade relations between us and the rest of the world, in the sense that the reports reaching us show that there are some antiquated policies underlining the WTO that keeps some nations, like some countries in Africa, as underdog. So with Dr. Mrs. Okonjo-Iweala, who has such a wealth of experience coming on board, I think that should be a plus for Nigeria and also the rest of the region, because I'm sure that when she gets there, she will have to review all those policies that has kept the nation under. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And also, just to follow up on that, she has said, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has said that, she reported to have said that the World Trade Organization is an ineffective policeman, using an outdated rule book that is unsuited for the challenges for the 21st century global economy. Do you think Nigeria and Africa have been at the receiving end of this so-called outdated rule book?
Yes, like I said earlier, because of our poor infrastructures, Nigeria and the rest of Africa, we have a lot of mineral resources and deposits all over, which the developed nations always crave for. We have gold, we have tin, we have bauxite, all those things, all those deposits, and so many others to mention. They are needed the world over for further development. Now, because of our poor infrastructures, with WTO in Akitsi, shall I say, with Dr. Mrs. Okonjo-Iweala now at the helm of affairs.
Mrs. Ogundana,
yes.
I'm sorry, we've pretty much run out of time. Sorry, apologies to cut you off there, but I do appreciate you coming on to talk to us about the budget and also a possible Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, World Trade Organization Director General position. We've been speaking with Mrs. Margaret Ogundana, who is a former Deputy Director of the Central Bank.